tonight, the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. We are back to our virtual programming for a few months while we do some major renovations in beautiful places like our reading room, where we are adding electrical outlets and new lighting so that it will be a much better place to read, to work, and to write your best-selling novel or historical tome. We're so pleased to have you all with us here tonight, whether you are a longtime member of the Athenaeum or this is your first time visiting. And if you enjoy what you hear tonight and what you learn and how you engage, we invite you to go to our website and look at becoming a member and participating in more programs. We'd love to have you part of this community of people who love to learn and engage together. Our guest tonight is a local historian, Aaron Sullivan. He's an historian and professor who actually lives not too far from me. We found out we're both at the same point in tonight's storm. So we're hoping that there will be no electrical outages, but if so, we will work our way around that. He is the author of The Disaffected, Britain's Occupation of Philadelphia During the American Revolution. And he teaches American history at Rider University in Lawrenceville, New Jersey, holding a doctorate in history from Tempe University and a bachelor's degree in computer science. That was a big turn from LeTourneau University in Longview, Texas. It's a pleasure to have you here tonight, Aaron, and invite everybody, if you have any questions anywhere along the way, to put those in the Q&A or the chat. And after Dr. Sullivan's talk, we will moderate those Q&A with him. Look forward to this conversation and invite all of you to join me in virtually welcoming Dr. Aaron Sullivan to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia.
Thank you very much, Beth. And thank all of you for letting me come onto your screens tonight. It gives me the opportunity to talk a little bit about my book and really to tell you some stories about the American Revolution and specifically about the British occupation of Philadelphia. Because, I mean, that's what we historians like to do. We like to tell stories about the past, hopefully interesting, useful stories about the past, but people seem to like that. The other thing historians tend to do is to take seemingly simple things and to complicate them. Or I guess rather to show how complicated they really were. That does not always make us as popular. Nonetheless, we do it because the truth is real life is always very complicated. The real past is always very complicated. And with that in mind, I would like to start off tonight by telling you a somewhat complicated story during the War for American Independence. So if I can set the scene here. We're going to start off in September of 1777. So the war is on, independence has been declared, but it's a long way from actually being won. The city of Boston has been liberated from British occupation, but the city of New York has fallen. And at this point, like even now, forces from Britain's army and navy are converging on the de facto capital of the revolution in the city of Philadelphia. And that's where we're going to go to, where a great and somewhat mysterious injustice is just about to take place. So with that said, let me introduce you to some of our primary characters tonight. We have Elizabeth and Henry Drinker. They're a married couple in revolutionary Philadelphia. They have had a lovely house there on Front Street, not far from Fritz Alley, which is still in the city. Lovely house. They had 5 children. Elizabeth called her house room enough in the city. She had a beautiful garden in the backyard, flowering trees. She wrote about how every summer she'd have a carpet of blue and white, or red and white petals all over the garden in the back. The Drinkers are Quakers, which incidentally is why we have their silhouettes here. Like many Quakers, they felt that portraits were vain, but they were okay with silhouettes. So we remember the Drinkers only in profile. Henry was a merchant. He made his money buying and selling goods as they came through the city. And like most Quakers in Pennsylvania at the time, they were pacifists. So this meant that when war broke out with Great Britain in 1775, Henry and Elizabeth tried very hard not to be involved. And their goal was whoever won this fight that they would be able to continue as they had before, with their faith, their family, and their business intact. So independence or empire, they hoped it really wouldn't make much difference for them. What they're going to find is that staying out of the struggle is much harder than they thought. So on September 2nd, 1777, Henry Drinker is at home. He's working from home that day because he's sick. It's a mild illness for him. But his youngest son and his namesake, who Elizabeth always refers to as Little Henry, which I think is adorable, Little Henry is very sick. Sick in a way that involves vomiting and worms and being bedridden. He's deathly ill. We won't go into greater detail about that. So Henry Drinker is working from home when he is arrested as an enemy of the state. 3 men from the Pennsylvania state government, the new state government, not the old colonial government of Pennsylvania, arrive, and they arrest him for, in their words, having evidenced a disposition inimical to the cause of America. Now, Henry and Elizabeth immediately protest. They say, 1, he's done no such thing. And 2, even if he had, that is not a crime, according to Pennsylvania's brand new state constitution, which declares that the people have a right to freedom of speech and of writing and of publishing their sentiments. None of this matters. Henry is arrested anyway. He is, in fact, never actually charged with any specific crime. He's never given a trial. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court will at one point intervene. They'll issue a writ of habeas corpus telling the government, you have to charge this man with a crime or you have to let him go. Makes no difference. Not only that does the government refuse to follow the court's orders, but they declare that when it comes to men like Henry Drinker, their enforcement is totally immune to any form of judicial interference, including writs of habeas corpus. Shortly after Henry is arrested, he and about 20 others, mostly Quakers and pacifists, are banished to the state of Virginia. 2 of them will die there. They'll never get back home. Their wives, their children, including Elizabeth Drinker and the very ill Little Henry, will be left alone in Philadelphia, even as the British Army occupies the city and makes it the seat of war. Now, this story goes on. What happens to Elizabeth? She has various adventures that are in more detail in the book. Some of them are fascinating. I'll just give you some brief spoilers here. First, maybe most importantly, Little Henry gets better. If you're out there worried about him, he does pull through. He's okay. Second, in her quest to get her husband back, Elizabeth Drinker will ultimately find herself at Valley Forge. She sits at a table with George and Martha Washington sharing dinner. She makes a very good impression on them. And she does eventually get her husband back. But it's a very long journey for both of them, both literally and metaphorically. But the mystery I want to talk with you about tonight is why. Why does this happen? Why would the new independent government of Pennsylvania, with the full knowledge and support of the Continental Congress, see someone like Henry Drinker, a neutral pacifist, as an enemy of the state, someone who needed to be arrested? Well, the answer, of course, is that it's complicated, because history is complicated. But to begin, we might consider what do we do with people like the Drinkers? Where do they fit into our understanding of the American Revolution? How do we categorize people like that? Well, let's think about what categories exist. In the simplest terms, this is a struggle between the British Empire and her American colonies, right? So we could say there are 2 sides. There are the Americans versus the British. That's a dichotomy the patriots like to use a lot, but I think we all know that's a little bit too simple. Not all Americans supported independence. Some fought for the British. So we can complicate that a little bit and recognize what we really have is the patriots versus the British and the loyalists. So groups like the Queen's Rangers, the Royal Legion, fighting for the British. So the colonists are divided, but we also know that there are many people in America who are not colonists, whose ancestors have been here for thousands of years. And so we recognize they're Native Americans, and they're going to participate on both sides. You've got groups like the Seneca, the Cherokee, the Mohawk, who are going to support the British. Groups like the Oneida, the Tuscarora will support the Patriots. We can farther diversify our revolution if we remember that even among those who crossed the Atlantic, they did not all come as colonists. They didn't all come willingly. Right? We have slaves and free blacks who participate, again, on both sides of the revolution. Some will fight for the Patriots, you see of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, but most who get involved in the fighting will tend to support the British. From Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment up through the Black Guides and Pioneers, the British tended to be quicker and more reliable in offering liberty in exchange for service. So we have them as well. If you're keeping up with your American history, you probably know that at some point in the past 50 years or so, historians have realized that not everyone who participated in the revolution was a man. Turns out there were women back then too. Some actively fought in the revolution. We have a few like Deborah Sampson here, who dressed as a man, fought for the Patriots, was honorably discharged, received a pension. But the truth is, no 18th century army survives without the support of thousands of women. Now, if we want to keep adding categories here, we can recognize we have the French, the Hessians, among other European groups. But the point is we have a variety of parts to play, and we can assign them to one side or the other, or in some cases, both. And that's what we've tended to do, both we as historians and we as Americans in general. When we learn about a new group of people in the revolution, we ask ourselves, which side of the conflict do we put them on? And we've tended to be very slow about looking at people who didn't pick a side in the revolution, people who were neutral or pacifist, or who thought both sides were in the wrong. People like Henry and Elizabeth Drinker. People who I'm going to call here the disaffected, right? People with no strong political affections. And you might reasonably ask, in the grand scheme of things, are these people worth talking about? Yes, they're there. We have the drinkers. Most Quakers fall into this category. And I think if you take historical literature as a whole, you probably find 20 to 40% of Americans are neutral in this conflict for at least some large chunk of it. So they're definitely there. But if they're neutral, if they're not committed to one side or the other, do they actually matter? Are they worth our talking about? The answer is yes. I wrote a book about them. I obviously think they're worth talking about. And I'd like to convince you that they are too. And I find that often the easiest way to do that is to look for a more modern day parallel. So let me take you back to a more recent conflict in American history. A more recent conflict, we had forces in blue and red, and they challenged each other to control the future of America. I'm kidding. I'm not going to do this. I won't do this to you. Modern politics gets people all bothered and upset. And 2020 is so recent, it's journalism, it's not history. No, we won't do that. There we go. Let's go back to the 2016 presidential election. Now, as you probably recall, 2016, the Democrat gets the majority of the popular vote, the Republican gets the majority in the Electoral College and thus wins. And when it's all over, we spent a lot of time as a nation talking about votes and talking about sides and looking at graphs like this one here. Right? And people on the TV talked all about, what did it mean that these people were on this side and that these other people were on this side, and on and on. We spent much less time looking at graphs like this one. And now, in case you're curious, this big green bar in the middle, those are not votes for the Green Party. This represents the plurality of eligible voters who did not vote for either major party candidate, and in the vast majority of cases, did not vote at all in the election. And by looking at these people, these non-participants, I think we can get some sense of what the disaffected of the revolution were like. It's not a perfect analogy, I confess, but I think it's helpful. So let's talk about these people. We can recognize that in both cases, these people had diverse reasons for not picking a side. Some of them were apathetic. They just really didn't care about the issues on the table, but some cared passionately, deeply about the issues on the table. They cared so much that they could not align themselves with either major side in the dispute. 2016, some people just hated both those candidates so much they could not get up and vote for either of them. Something similar happens during the revolution. You have people who reject the actions of the British Empire, but also reject the patriot response, and they can't pick a side. We can recognize that in both cases, the group we're talking about is not unified. And it tends not to be as vocal as the partisans for one side or the other. There are phrases you can rally people around, get them excited about. Phrases like liberty, or God save the king, or make America great again. Right? But it's very hard to get a crowd to rally around a banner that says, I don't want to get involved. Right? That's hard to get people excited about. They don't stand up and shout that. We can recognize that we're not talking about some sort of ideal neutrality here, as if they weighed both sides and decided they came up exactly even. What we're talking about is a lack of sacrifice, people who aren't going to make a sacrifice for one side against the other, to help one side win over the other. Now, in an election, that sacrifice is you have to get up and go vote. But in a bloody revolution, the sacrifices could be much, much higher. And finally, we should recognize that the people we're talking about are pivotal to understanding what happened and to what it was like to experience it. If you want to understand the experience of the 2016 election, you have to understand the perspective of those people who were just utterly disenchanted with both choices offered. If you want to understand why that election went the way it did, you've got to wrestle with the plurality of voters who sat the thing out. The same is true of the revolution. If we care about understanding what happened, why it happened, and what it was like to experience that struggle, we cannot ignore the disaffected there. So, let me tell you about some more of them specifically, give you a sense of different ways people found themselves in that disaffected space. Some of, we'll call it the flavors of disaffection. So I have a couple men named Benjamin. Neither of them are Benjamin Franklin. You probably know about him already. He definitely picked a side. But we're going to start with a man named Benjamin Chew. Benjamin Chew was the Chief Justice of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, the last Chief Justice of the colonial era, so before independence. He lived at Clifton in Germantown, a house which still stands. Every year they have a mock battle of Germantown there, which is worth seeing if you're in the area. Benjamin Chew was a friend of George Washington. He was a friend of John Adams. He was a very outspoken opponent of British oppression. Really, from the Stand Back forward, Chew was very clear that he felt what Britain was doing was illegal and it was wrong. But he was also a firm believer in law and order and in lawful authority. In the very last case, where he was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he issued a decision in which he said, an opposition of force of arms to the lawful authority of the king and his ministers is high treason. You cannot take up arms against the government. That's the definition of treason. But in the very same decision, he also ruled that in the moment when the king or his ministers shall exceed the constitutional authority vested in them by the Constitution, submission to their mandates becomes treason. It's treason if you do, treason if you don't. Chew very much felt himself trapped by the dictates of his own very sincere and strongly held political beliefs. He couldn't support George III and what he was doing. He also could not support a war against the king and parliament. The result is that he makes himself neutral, and despite, or maybe because of that, he's briefly arrested by the Patriots. He's imprisoned in New Jersey for about a year, but even when he's released, he removes himself entirely from politics. He chooses not to get involved. He goes from being one of the most influential men in Pennsylvania to a nobody, head down, all the way through the rest of the war. Now, my other Benjamin is a man named Benjamin Town. I don't have a picture of him, but I do have a picture of his newspaper. Benjamin Town was the founder and the publisher of the Pennsylvania Evening Post, America's first thrice weekly newspaper. So he published not once, not twice, but 3 times every week. And I think it's fair to say Benjamin Town was a man who cared about quantity more than quality. He was also a man of remarkably flexible politics. So he founds the Post in 1776 in Philadelphia, and he founds it as a fiercely pro-independence, anti-British newspaper. And that was a very good idea in 1776. Because in that year, every loyalist-leaning paper in the city gets run out of town, or in one case, burned to the ground. So the Post is there, fiercely pro-independence. But in 1777, the British occupy the city of Philadelphia, and all the printers flee. Right? They don't want to be arrested for treason against King George. They don't want to have their presses seized, possibly melted down. So they all flee the city, except for Benjamin Town. He stays and has, in that moment, a complete change of heart and becomes a passionate defender of the king and the British Empire, and talks about how deluded he was by the Patriots, and he continues to publish the Evening Post now as a fiercely loyalist paper. And because it is the only newspaper still operating in Philadelphia after the occupation begins, every public announcement, every royal proclamation, every advertisement must go through the Evening Post, and he makes a great deal of money in the weeks and months before new presses arrive from other loyalist ports. But then in 1778, of course, the British evacuate Philadelphia, and the Patriots return. And all those other presses that came down from Halifax or over from London, they pack up, and they leave, not wanting to be arrested and persecuted by the Patriots. But not Benjamin Town. He stays in Philadelphia, and again has a sudden change of heart, and realizes, my golly, I was right the first time. Independence is what we need. King George is a tyrant, and he continues to print the Pennsylvania Evening Post as a fiercely pro-independence newspaper, and again, makes a great deal of money while these other presses are trying to get to the city. So there's no one script to disaffection here. Some people, like Chu, care so much about doing the right thing that they really can't join either side. So they end up just disappearing from public life. Other people, like Town, they don't really have any strong feelings about the politics of it one way or the other. They can join this side or that side or both or neither, wherever the profit is. But I'll point out, neither of these people seem terribly threatening, especially not those like Chu or Drinker, whose response is to disengage from the struggle entirely. So back to our opening mystery. Why would the revolutionaries arrest a man like Henry Drinker or a man like Benjamin Chu? Well, to understand that, we need to understand how the American revolutionaries answered some key questions about what they were doing. And now when I was categorizing people from the revolution, I ended with those who didn't pick a side. But it's worth asking if that was really an option. I mean, is it really possible to not pick a side in a revolution? Or is this one of those cases where, not picking a side is really picking a side? I'm not going to drag you back to modern politics, but I leave it to your imagination to think of modern debates where choosing not to speak out, not to get involved, effectively puts you on one side against the other. It turns out that from the perspective of most American revolutionaries, the answers to these questions is no, you cannot be neutral in this revolution. If you are not explicitly for us, you are in effect against us. And we see that response in all sorts of ways, really throughout the revolution. Even before the war begins, the British are protesting taxation, or the Americans are protesting British taxation. Right? And they're against anybody who continues to buy goods imported from Britain. They tended to describe people who did not join the boycott as foes to the rights of British America or enemies of American liberty. That's harsh language. It's taken directly from the Articles of Association, which Congress passed in 1774. And this language, enemy of American liberty, it's not aimed at people who stand up and say, rah, rah, taxation and King George. This is aimed at anyone who will not change their commercial habits to support the boycott. So maybe you are buying the very same tea from the very same person you've always bought tea from. And yesterday that was fine. Today, it makes you an enemy of American liberty. In writing about these commercial choices, James Madison referred to them as, quote, the method used among us to distinguish friends from foes. And you can hear that dichotomy right there. There's not a lot of wiggle room. You're a friend or you're a foe. We see the same thing if we look at the militia, especially in places like Pennsylvania that didn't have a long history of universal militia service like the New England colonies did. Very early on, the Pennsylvania militia was obviously representing violent resistance against Britain. But militia service was not optional in Pennsylvania. You couldn't take the position. You would really rather not be involved in this. The law mandated participation, and the fines it levied against those who did not participate were meant to be crushing. A common laborer could owe as much as a third of his annual income just to pay this one fine for non-participation in the militia. Outside the law, those who did participate in the militia almost always looked on those who did not as loyalists. But most starkly in Pennsylvania, we see this attitude in the Test Act, which is a law passed in 1777 that required every adult white male in the state to take an oath. That oath, they had to renounce George III as king, they had to swear their allegiance to Pennsylvania as an independent state, and they had to swear that they would inform against anyone, friends, family, neighbors, anyone, who they thought was inimical to the cause of the United States. And if you refuse to swear this oath, you lose the right to vote, you lose the right to hold office, you lose the right to serve in juries, you lose the right to use the courts to sue anyone who cheats or defrauds you. You cannot buy, sell, or inherit property, and you cannot bear arms. If you persist in refusing to take the Test Act, you can be banished from the state entirely. So the Patriots, I think, are very clear here. They do not like to tolerate neutrality. You need to pick a side. Really, they want it to be their side. But having established that, I think we're still left with the question of why? Why would they do that? Why not just let neutrals be neutral? Why arrest a man like Henry Drinker? And that is wrapped up in what they're trying to accomplish here. We have to think about it. The American patriots are taking up arms against their government, and ultimately they're going to be creating a new nation. How do you justify that? What gives you the right to use violence in that way? And revolutionary ideology said they have the right to do this because they represent the will of the people. The people are the only legitimate source of authority. We can hear that in the common phrase, no taxation without representation. The point is not that all taxation is bad or that there is some threshold of taxation you cannot go above. Right? The Americans are going to tax each other. They will tax each other much higher than the British ever dared tax them. The point is that you cannot levy taxes against the people without their consent, right? Without them, through their representatives, giving consent to those taxes. Now, the Patriots claimed that the British Parliament could not really represent the people of America. And the implication there was that the Patriot governments did represent the people. That's why they had a right to do this. But it turns out that claim is very hard to prove. And to see why, I'd like you all to join me here in a hypothetical, but I confess mildly treasonous, thought experiment. Let us say that in light of chaos and disputes going on in Washington, D.C. these days, we decide we are done with the United States of America, and by golly, we are going to form our own country. We, meaning all of us here in the Zoom meeting, we're going to make our own country. I have taken the liberty of making us a flag. There we are. Now, let us further suppose that when we issued this call for independence, the number of people in this meeting who spoke out, or I suppose chatted out, in support of our movement was greater than the number who spoke out against us. In short, we have a situation like this. And being a strong believer in the sovereignty of the people and government by consent of the governed, I look at this and I declare that by the authority of the people, the Athenaeum was and ought to be free and independent. I know we can't hear you, but I'm assuming you're all yelling, huzzah, there in front of your computers. But now, what if it turned out there was actually another group of people here, maybe a large group, and when we put out our call for independence, they actually didn't say anything at all, either for or against us. Maybe they didn't take the idea of a Zoom meeting seceding from the nation seriously for some reason, or thought, give it a little time, things will get better with the nation as it is. Maybe they thought that I, as a historian with no service in public office before, would not do a better job of leading a nation than our current leaders. In that case, I'm somewhat offended. But either way, we have a situation like this. Wouldn't the existence of all of these uncommitted, silent, hesitant people give you pause? Wouldn't it make you wonder if maybe my declaring our independence on behalf of the people was a little bit premature? Certainly it is going to decrease the odds that France will recognize our independence and come to our aid militarily. I mean, at the very least, wouldn't you, even you who are now my loyal revolutionaries, wouldn't you feel better? Wouldn't you feel that our nation was more secure if we could get these people to publicly, visibly express support for the independence we have already declared? The American patriots are in this position when it comes to neutrals and non-participants. If they ask someone, do you support American independence? And that someone says, yes, I do. Well, then they are justifying the moral foundation of the revolution, the will of the people. But if they say no, or if they say they just don't really care, or say, leave me alone, I've got an 18th century farm here that I'm focused on that, their lack of consent is undermining the moral foundation of the revolution and the war. Britain is constantly accusing the patriots of imposing American independence on the people against their will. The patriot leadership is very sensitive about that. And since they sincerely believe themselves to be on the side of American liberty, they see these neutral people as effectively on the other side, and thus the enemies of American liberty. We should also recognize here that when Congress goes to war against Great Britain, it does so with no real army and no real money. They need a great many people willing to take up arms and get involved in the fighting and to accept what are effectively unbacked IOUs in return. And if they don't get that, it's going to be a very, very short war. So anyone who suggests just that this cause is not worth great personal sacrifice, they are threatening the very survival of the revolution. And this brings us back to men like Drinker and Chew, people who were persecuted, who were arrested, not so much for picking the wrong side, but because they failed to pick a side at all. What does the revolution do with people like this? I mean, in a perfect world, you would convert them to your side. You would persuade them to come over. But at the very least, you need some way to get their resources from them so you can fight this war. And you need to get them to at least pretend to support the cause, or somehow convince other people and to convince yourself that their dissenting voices or their silence on the issue doesn't count, that somehow we don't need to take them into consideration. How do you do that? You do it through the means we looked at before. You can mandate participation, right? You can pass laws that say you have to participate in the boycotts. You have to swear an oath of allegiance to the independent state. You must fight in the militia. Secondly, you can design your punishment for people who break these laws so that you kind of get what you wanted anyway. And so if you don't want to fight in the militia, well, we'll pass a law that says we take away your guns, we take away your ammunition, and we fine you heavily, and we use those resources to prosecute the war anyway. And finally, if these people aren't going to swear that they will support the new government, you take away the right to vote, you take away the right to hold office, to be heard in court, etc. Contemporary at the time referred to this as civil excommunication, that you essentially negate somebody's existence as a member of society. And then they don't have a voice anymore. And if, push really comes to shove, you banish them from your state. And then they don't have a voice because they're not here anymore. This is what ultimately happens to Henry Drinker and his fellows. Right? It is all about changing the perception from this back to this, which is a much more comfortable place if you're leading a revolution. Henry Drinker, after he is arrested, he and all those who are arrested with him are repeatedly given the opportunity to obey the Test Act, swear loyalty to the state of Pennsylvania, and be released. Understandably, most of them chose not to pledge their loyalty to a state which had just unlawfully arrested them. And it is entirely possible that the government would have tried other methods to persuade them to bring them over, short of banishment. But the truth is, they ran out of time with Henry Drinker, because the British were coming, had already, in fact, invaded Pennsylvania, were well on the way to occupying Philadelphia, and banishing Drinker and his fellows to Virginia was a desperate measure taken at a desperate time. And this is why the British occupation of Philadelphia matters in the story, why it's at the center of the book. We've talked about what disaffection means here, and about why it was a problem for the revolutionaries. But in normal circumstances, disaffected people can be really hard to find. People who don't want to be involved in a conflict rarely draw attention to that fact. It is usually in their best interest to keep their head down and to take whatever is the path of least resistance. Do whatever they need to do so that the Patriots or the British leave them alone and let them get back to their regular lives, to their farms, to their families, to their businesses. So you find people who don't really care one way or the other about independence, maybe even think it's probably a bad idea, but who will nonetheless drift along with the revolutionary current because it's the path of least resistance. And in most places, at most times during the war, it's the best way to avoid drawing attention to yourself. So how do we tell the difference between someone who refuses to buy British imports because they really believe in this cause and someone who just doesn't want to be called an enemy of American liberty? How do we tell the difference between someone who joins the militia because they really believe in the cause and someone who joins the militia because they just don't want to be fined? How do we tell the difference between a newspaper printer who is pro-independence because he believes in the cause and someone who is pro-independence because that's what's selling this year in Philadelphia? What we do is we look at how they respond in times of transition. And the British occupation is a moment of immense transition in Philadelphia and the surrounding area. Think about it. Philadelphia begins this story as the capital of a British colony in America. But a year later, it's the capital of the United States, at war with Great Britain for independence. A year later, during the occupation, it is the headquarters of the British Army in America, fighting to put down that revolutionary movement. And 1 year later, it is again the capital of the United States, waging a war for independence. With each of these transitions, the path of least resistance changed dramatically. Words and deeds that would have had you in good stead with the local power 1 year are deadly treason the next year. This is the key moment. Right? What do people do during these transitions? Right? At times when neither the British nor the Patriots really have control, when neither of them can really enforce their will on the other, when one power is leaving and the other is coming, what do people do? When the British first march into Pennsylvania and the invasion begins, what do people do? What does the militia do? Do they rally to support independence and throw the British out? Or do they all defect and join the British Army to secure the empire? Or do they just quietly go back home? Because for that moment, no one could really force them to do anything they didn't want to do. These are the moments when we see which side people are really on, or if they're on a side at all. So what happens when the British invade? Let's look at the militia. Right. What we see in Pennsylvania is a revolution, and not just a war, but the revolution is a political movement that really begins to fall apart. When the British invade, Congress tells the state government to give Washington 4,000 militiamen to help him defend the capital city of Philadelphia. And the state begins calling up troops, calling up the militia. Now, up until this point, when Pennsylvania tried to call up the militia, they usually got about a 50% response rate from the city of Philadelphia. It's not great, but it'll do. Once the British invade and have boots on the ground in Pennsylvania, the response rate falls to 15%, the lowest of the entire war. And 1 in 4 of those who do turn out to serve in the militia go back home before their term is over. They desert. So, rather than fielding the 4,000 men Congress called for, Pennsylvania manages about 2,000 men in early September when the invasion begins. And by mid-October, they're down to about 1,200 militiamen still in service. By the time the new year rolls around, we're at about 450 militiamen still serving. And on February 15th, 1778, the main force of the Pennsylvania militia consists of 60 men fit for duty, and they are stationed in a tavern 17 miles away from the nearest British detachment. The militia falls apart. And it's not just militiamen who suddenly seem to forget that they're in the middle of a war for their independence. If you look at Washington's papers, right, there at Valley Forge, as he's writing about the deprivation and the hunger of the Continental Army, you will find report after report after report of flour, produce, livestock flowing from the countryside into occupied Philadelphia and the hands of the British Army. These are provisions the American Army desperately needed in that moment, but the farmers of the Delaware Valley overwhelmingly preferred to take their goods to the British, and they continue to do so in spite of everything Washington can think to do to stop them. When it comes to the Test Act, almost from the moment the British arrive in Pennsylvania, people stop swearing allegiance to the independent state. The Patriot government will constantly revise the deadline for when everyone is supposed to have sworn allegiance because the people just won't do it. Right, so the occupation shows us Pennsylvania is rife with disaffection. When push comes to shove, most people are not strongly committed to the revolution, at least not in 1777. And this is a real problem for them. Washington needs those supplies. The Valley Forge soldiers need that food, which is being sold to the British. Now, fortunately for the United States, these people weren't loyalists either. They were no more committed to the British Empire than they were to American independence. They are disaffected, not loyalists. The Patriot militia does fall apart completely. But try as they might, and they do try, the British cannot raise Pennsylvanian soldiers to fight for them. Howe comes into the state hoping, and actually fairly confident, he's going to get 5,000 loyalist recruits from Pennsylvania. He doesn't manage a quarter of that. Those farmers who are so eager to trade with the British, while the British have gold and silver in the occupied city, as soon as France joins the war and it's clear the British are on their way out, they go right back to trading with Washington and the Continental Army. And while these people will not take the Test Act and swear allegiance to Pennsylvania, they also nearly all refuse to swear allegiance to King George III when the British Army asks them to. So Washington is never able to get the support he needs to drive the British out of the American capital. The British Army never gets the support it needs to move beyond that first foothold. And ultimately, the occupation of Philadelphia is going to end not with some epic battle, but when the British finally decide it's just not worth the trouble, they have better uses for their army somewhere else. Now, skipping to the end, you've probably noticed that the Patriots ultimately win this war and America becomes independent. And at that point, the victors immediately started writing their history books. And as you might expect from what we've said so far, they would really like that history not to include silent or dissenting American voices. They want a vision of the revolution that shows a united, consenting people who support their war for independence. And for a great amount of time, they were pretty successful in getting that. Right? If we go back to this list of categories, this list of different people who were there during the revolution, it's structured roughly in the order in which historians have paid attention to these groups, beginning with very simple dichotomies from the war years itself, and then slowly adding people as we went along and recognized their importance. But you'll note that those non-participants, the disaffected, are down at the bottom. Revolutionary historians have really only become interested in them fairly recently. And I think we have a lot more to learn about their perspective and about our traditional tendency to overlook them. So let me conclude with one more story this evening about a different disaffected family. This is the house of the Whittle family. They lived in what is now Red Bank Battlefield Park near Woodbury, New Jersey, and this house is still there. You can go and tour it there on the battlefield. Like the Drinkers, the Whittles were Quakers. They were pacifists, and with a couple distant relations as an exception, their family strove to avoid involvement in the revolution, and particularly the war. Joe Whittle, the eldest son of the family, kept a diary from 1775 to 1779, and remarkably, he made an entry in this diary almost every single day. And I've read his whole diary, every entry, all the way through, in researching this book. And really, the most remarkable thing about the diary of Joe Whittle is how incredibly boring it is. Oh my gosh. 1775 to 1779. This is some of the most interesting moments of the Revolution. Right? The Battle of Lexington, the Siege of Boston, the Declaration of Independence right across the river from him in Philadelphia. All the battles around New York, the occupation of Philadelphia, the evacuation of Philadelphia, again, right past his house. Job doesn't write about any of this. Instead, he writes a lot about cows. And he writes about fixing fences and work on the school board, and when people got sick and when they got better, and who came to Quaker meeting this week, who did not come to Quaker meeting this week, and on and on. And it may be unfair to call that boring. If you are studying the life of a farmer in 1770s America, Job's diary is a rare treasure. But if you are looking for some sort of action-filled story of the Revolutionary War, or some thoughtful consideration of the merits and demerits of independence, you will be sorely disappointed by Job's diary. So what we have in the Whittles really is a family that is disinterested in the war. They are as far from picking a side as you can get. And as fate would have it, a giant battle is fought in the front yard. This is Fort Mercer. The Patriots built it on the Delaware River to try to keep the British fleet from getting up to Philadelphia. And they built it on the property of James Whittle, Job's father. You can, in fact, see his house there on the left side of the screen, right next to the fort. They built this fort on top of what had been his orchard before. They did not ask him. They did not pay him. As a neutral in this conflict, he really didn't have say in it one way or the other. On October 22nd, 1777, Hessians assault Fort Mercer as part of the Philadelphia campaign. It's a bloody battle. There's something like 1,500 casualties by the end of the day. And the Whittles can see the whole thing from their house. Again, in this depiction, if you look on the left-hand side, that's their house. Right there, they really could look out the window and watch this battle unfold. And according to their family tradition, that's what Job's mother, Anne, did. Anne Whittle began the battle in that upstairs room next to the window with her spinning wheel, spinning while the battle went on. About halfway through, a stray cannonball went through the gable over her head, ricocheted around in the attic, and rolled down the steps next to her. At which point, she gathered up all her goods and picked up her spinning wheel and presumably stepped over that cannonball and went down to the cellar and continued spinning for the rest of the battle. When the Battle of Fort Mercer is over, the Whittle home becomes this place of blood and bodies. The Patriots were victorious. They defended their fort, and they take over the house to make a field hospital. And they will eventually kick James and Anne Whittle out of their house. But while they're there, Anne spends her time tending the wounded, regardless of which side they were on. They were probably mostly Hessians based on the breakdown of the battle, but she acts as a nurse and does what she can for all of them. And then they're forced to leave. And that really is the end of their involvement in America's war for independence. Years pass. How does history remember James and Anne Whittle? Well, James, Job's father, tends to always be recounted as a loyalist, not for anything he did for Great Britain, but because he protested when the Patriots built the fort on his orchard and repeatedly went after them to get them to pay for that orchard. Anne Whittle, Job's mother, who stayed by her husband's side all through this whole thing, is now remembered as the heroine of Red Bank. In 1905, the Daughters of the American Revolution named their chapter in Woodbury after her, and they hailed her as, quote, a patriot nurse who assisted in establishing American independence. Because that's what we do. We have to put everybody on one side or the other. That's the stories we tell. There are the Americans versus the British. And yes, over time, we make allowances for loyalists, Native Americans, people of color, women soldiers, etc. But all too often, we break it down to, well, which side do we put them on? And we lose the stories and lose the experiences of the people in the middle. And these people are important, right? These are the people who most clearly saw the revolution as disturbing, the war as scary and tragic. Not some glorious cause to be won, not some unnatural rebellion that needed to be put down, but as a tragedy they had to endure. They're the ones who saw the revolution as complicated. And we should not, I'd say we dare not lose their perspective. Thank you very much for listening to me talk about them for the last 45 minutes.
Thank you, Aaron. This is wonderful. We heard from one individual that they were surprised when they logged on to find out that you're talking about the drinkers, since they're related to them, which I think is one of the lovely things about Philadelphia. We often find these connections with families. Please put your questions in the chat or the Q&A, and I will moderate them. I usually don't do this, but I want to start with a question of my own. What led you into this line of research?
Well, This started very early on as part of my dissertation. I was going to write about the British occupation of Philadelphia. No one had done it for a while, and no one had taken at all social look at it. So I began looking into it. And I started looking outside the city at the surrounding counties when the British invaded and how Washington responded to it. And I saw Washington constantly complaining about how the people of Pennsylvania are not supporting us. They do not support the revolution. They're all against us. And at the time I thought, this is my dissertation, maybe my book one day. I'm going to show you that Pennsylvania was really loyalist during the war. People haven't recognized it. So I started down that path, and then I got into the occupied city itself and looked at British records. And there was General Howe and Grant and Cornwallis and writing about how the people of Pennsylvania are all against us. None of them are going to support us to reclaim this colony for the king. I thought, well, wait a minute. You're all talking about the same people at the same time, and you're both complaining about how they're on the other side. Something's wrong here. That sense of there just being two sides is off. So then I started digging into how else do we define these people who won't support either side, who have angered effectively both of the belligerents. And that led me here.
Thank you. I love it how we start off on our questions, particularly for our dissertations, but even later on, that as scholars, you find that those questions lead you in directions you didn't expect. And glad you can share this with us. Nancy is wondering what sort of things are reflected in Elizabeth Drinker's diary.
Elizabeth Drinker's diary is amazing. I'm not at all unique in using Drinker. Anyone who looks at Philadelphia in this period is going to rely on Drinker. She kept such fantastic records, especially during the occupation. Again, almost every day she's writing something down. And unlike many of the diaries, especially diaries from businessmen or soldiers who are very much focused on the war itself and battles, Drinker writes about how she feels about things and what her experience is like and the people she visits and what they talk about. She is just an immense treasure. For much of the book and to try to get her story, I found a series of letters she wrote to her husband while he was exiled in Virginia. Those are over at the Haverford Library. They're wonderful. She writes about her life there, taking care of the kids in the city and what they're dealing with, and you can sort of feel both the affection between them, the struggle it is being far apart, and comparing that to her diary then lets you see the things she's not telling her husband about. There are cannibals smashing into buildings in Philadelphia. She doesn't mention that to Henry at all.
That's really fascinating. And Daniel is wondering if you can tell us anything about spies. Would they have fabricated and shifted their stories in order to hide their loyalties?
So we know there are spies on both sides. I think more's been written about Washington spies that are in Philadelphia, trying to get a sense of what the British are doing. Are they ever going to break out of Philadelphia and try to expand this invasion? They, of course, never do that successfully. So there's an intentional spy network funneling information back to Washington, but all of these people who are trading with the British in the city are carrying information along with them. Some of them do that intentionally, but a lot of it is just very incidental. The British talk about how they get their information not just through intentional espionage, but because these women who come to trade with Philadelphia are very chatty, and so they send out horsemen to guard them. And they will tell these British cavalry officers all sorts of information about where the American revolutionaries are. Not because they're trying to be spies, but they're just talking. We see some spies will dress as women. We see people try to smuggle things out of the city at one point. Two women pretend to be pregnant so they can hide goods in front of them and they get caught. There's a lot of espionage. Both sides are desperate to get information about the other.
And Marjorie's wondering if disaffected Quakers were treated differently than other members of the public who were disaffected. Were they seen as more suspect or less? Did they receive the same treatment?
So what makes the Quakers really stand out? And I should say, in fairness, they're not all disaffected. Some of them obviously served with the Patriots. You've got Nathaniel Greene, who's a Quaker. Betsy Ross has a Quaker background, and some will support the British, but most of them fall into that disaffected category. But what makes them really different from most disaffected people in Pennsylvania is they are disaffected as a matter of principle. then they are not ashamed to tell you that they're not going to get involved in this and why. Whereas most people who are disaffected, principled or not, they're not going to tell you unless they have to. They know that's a recipe for trouble. So the Quakers will tell you about it, they'll tell you why and describe the reasoning, which makes them very tempting to look at and much easier to find than most of the other people.
And once they were caught for them, did they, did Henry Drieger, was his experience different from a non-Quaker, non-Loyalist, for example?
I mean, I would say probably. There is an animosity toward the Quakers from many revolutionaries in Pennsylvania. The Quakers were sort of the established government. They tended to run things until the years running up to the revolution. So they're seen as the establishment. You look farther out into the more distant counties of Pennsylvania, you have a lot more Presbyterians, Congregationalists, who have a bone to pick with the Quakers. In some cases, for good reasons, they are underrepresented in the government the Quakers run. So there's some animosity there, which probably played itself out when they had the Quakers under their control.
Sounds like future research.
Maybe so.
And Michael's wondering if other occupied cities had similar dynamics play out. So is Philadelphia a microcosm for the larger experience during the war?
In some ways. So Philadelphia, I mean, I think it's very interesting because it's such a quick snapshot. The British are only in it for 9 months, as opposed to New York, where the British remained for years, all the way until the end of the war. So in Pennsylvania, we get that turnaround, that those moments of transition packed much more closely together. But you can see in that moment when they held Philadelphia, the British do have a game plan. They will try to implement in Philadelphia things that worked for them in New York, both as the way they try to house people, the kind of defenses they want to erect, their plans for building up loyalists, even the ways they entertain themselves in Philadelphia are based on what they tried to learn in New York. Similarly, when they occupy cities in the South later in the war, I think we can see some of the lessons they learned in Philadelphia played out there, that will inform their attempts to occupy southern cities.
Well, thank you. This is wonderful. As you see, we're getting thanks from people coming from Barcelona, Delaware, Florida, really local, who've all enjoyed your conversation. I hope you all will come back to more programs. You can find us online at philaathenaeum.org and click on events to see upcoming events. Many of our events for the coming weeks are going to be our noontime or 2 o'clock programs on a number of interesting events. But if you found this one interesting, you might enjoy July 27th. Put that on your calendar for next month, looking at Eastern State Penitentiary as the deviant prison, to look at how the idea of the prison as it was shaped under Eastern State really created a lot of issues and questions. So a lot coming up, and please go to our website and register for programs. We'd love to see you at more. Thank you, Aaron. This has been a really fantastic. I love the way you presented the class too, and drew us all in. And as a number of people said, you helped them look at the revolution from a different perspective. And want to wish everybody a wonderful night. Happy June. Yeah, frankly riveting from